is that workers could take part in a lawful industrial action ballot, vote to take strike action, go through all the hurdles and barriers that the government puts around industrial action. Their employer could then say to them, you have to come into work, and if they don't, they could be sacked. And I just don't think there's any appetite at all, Nick, from the public or indeed from employers to be in a situation where nurses, paramedics, teachers, railway workers, others could potentially face the sack for exercising what is recognised as a fundamental right. So we think the government should think again, and we're urging MPs to vote against the bill when it comes into the Commons this evening.
Paul, these aren't scare tactics, you're saying. Surely if there were a government representative, he or she would say, no, we're not saying that at all, Paul. What we're saying is we need a certain level of teachers or nurses or firefighters in place. We're not threatening bullying action such as strikes. Paul Nowak.
Well, actually, the legislation is very clear, Nick, that people could lose their jobs if they fail to comply with these minimum service level orders. And that's one thing that doesn't happen anywhere else in Europe. And the government has been very fond about talking about minimum service levels in other countries. The fact is, in the UK, you could lose your job if you didn't follow that request to come into work. We think that that's completely untenable. So we're calling on all MPs, actually, to oppose the legislation, and at the very least calling on Conservative MPs to support the House of Lords amendments, which would remove that threat of a worker being sacked for exercising a fundamental right. If that's what the government is saying, then put the money where their mouth is, support that amendment and take that threat away.
And just lastly on that, how confident are you that when it comes to disputes, and we'll touch on those in a moment, Paul, when it comes to disputes involving fire service or the NHS, that a minimum level is always put in by the relevant staff? How confident are you that happens on each occasion?
Well, you only have to look at what did happen during the industrial action in the NHS, Nick. And I was on those picket lines, as you know, with paramedics who worked very closely with their employers to make sure they provided emergency cover. And this is, it's not just the TUC saying this legislation is problematic. The rail employers, the Chartered Institute of Personnel Development, others on the employer side of the table have warned that this potentially could exacerbate industrial relations problems, prolong strikes, and as I say, it's a bill that's not fit for purpose, and MPs should vote it down.
More generally, certainly a week doesn't go back. Sometimes it seems hardly a day doesn't go by without some form of industrial action, whether it is in our health service, whether it's with our teachers or other. What do you see? What has caused this backdrop of industrial unrest, would you say, Paul?
I think all of those disputes are different, Nick, but fundamentally underpinning all of them is that people just can't afford another year of a real terms pay cut. And, you know, our unions and those public sector workers were saying to the government a year ago. And now most of our unions in the health service have now reached agreement with the government, but it took months just to get them to the negotiating table. And I would say, actually, this is an abject lesson in government failing to sit round a table and negotiate seriously to resolve the problems. Because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter whether you're a paramedic, a teacher, a civil servant. Asking people to swallow yet another real terms pay cut is really difficult after a decade of pay restraint.
We last spoke in February, the 1st of February, which the media called Walkout Wednesday. You kindly came to the studio, if you recall, and took some listeners' calls. Are we closer or further away from some form of coordinated general strike action than we were then?
Well, I mean, what we talked about then, Nick, was resolving the disputes, the underlying issues behind these disputes. Now, as I say, since February the 1st, most of our unions in the health service have reached agreement on pay going forward. I would love to see the government step up in the civil service and in education and deliver a real meaningful pay rise and a funded pay rise, crucially, for those workers as well. And, you know, ending these disputes isn't rocket science. What we need is political will and for the government to step up to the plate and make sure that public servants don't suffer real terms pay cuts. And I think, you know, that's what I'm focused on rather than coordinating, theoretical
more
action. What we want is to resolve these disputes.
Finally, a comment on a story today, if you would. Education union leaders have said a recommended 6.5% pay rise for teachers in England shows the government is, quotes, out of touch. This is the School Teachers Review body recommending teachers get a pay rise 2 percentage points higher than the 4.3% made in March by Gillian Keegan, Education Secretary.
Yeah, and I think the education unions are absolutely right, Nick. We've got a recruitment and retention crisis in our classrooms, and I think the School Teachers Pay Review Body has recognised that. The crucial thing now is that the government implements the findings of that pay review body and, crucially, funds that pay rise, because what you can't have is a pay rise for teachers that would mean school budgets that are already under pressure are stretched even further. So time for the government to accept those pay review body findings in full and to properly fund a pay rise for every teacher up and down the country.
Come and see us again soon. I know my listeners would love the opportunity to put some calls to you when you can.